a Dear Media original podcast.
What is it that's making Black people sick? It's not just race, right? It's not the phenotype of someone, how they physically look. It's how they are treated in our society because of how they look. I am Dr. Rachel Hardeman. I am a mother. I am a wife. I am a sister. I am the Blue Cross Endowed Professor of Health and Racial Equity at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health and the founding director of the Center for Anti-Racism Research for Health Equity. And I would also add, I'm an aunt.
Dr. Rachel Hardeman witnessed the absence of care in our healthcare system as a teenager. She also felt the impact of impersonal medicine that reduces people to statistics. It compelled her to question what is making Black people sick. And answering this question will become her life's work and part of her identity. Inspired by her incredibly vibrant grandmother and the support of her loving family, Dr. Hardeman will ask the questions no one is asking and advocate for the implementation of health equity for Black people in a culture of medicine that treats people based on how they look and not biology. We know that race is a social construct that allows for othering, falsehoods, inequity, and racist systems. But we don't always think about how those systems inform the industry of healthcare and how the filter of race-based medicine is negatively affecting Black lives, including hers. I'm your executive producer, Tracy Ellis Ross, and this is I Am America, where we meet people who are redefining their own identity, the ideas of community, and the possibility of our country. These stories are beautiful, heavy, and light, and they allow us to reimagine and reframe what we know about this country. Today's story is produced by showrunner Nicole Hill, and this is Dr. Rachel Hardeman.
When I sat down with Dr. Rachel Hardeman, my first question, for not entirely unselfish reasons, was how does she go about finding a doctor?
Oh, interesting. I have no idea. I mean, I have a hard time picking a physician often, or I'll go to someone for a little bit and then change it up because I am analyzing everything. One of the telltale signs as a Black woman and the mother of a biracial and Black child is looking around and being able to see artwork and photos on the wall that represent our community and the people that we, care about and love, and also a staff that represents the same. And so I look for a lot of those cues that tell me that this is a space and this is a clinic that has embraced the community that they're serving and caring for. And really, it's like signals of love and humanity.
Dr. Hardeman learned to look for these signals in part while growing up in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the 90s, watching physicians care for her grandmother.
So my grandmother was an incredibly vibrant person, an impeccable dresser, and always had beautiful accessories, and I loved it about her. She was a community organizer and someone who was very vocal and out front in the community, particularly the Black community. And I learned a lot from her about what it meant to ask questions and to explore answers to those questions. And on the other side of her life, she was also grappling with chronic illness and specifically kidney disease. And so from the time I was a child, she was receiving dialysis, meaning she had to be in a dialysis clinic multiple days a week to get care for her kidneys that weren't functioning.
Dr. Hardeman would sit with her grandmother in the clinic and do her homework and watch as different physicians stopped by to attend to her. What she noticed is that her grandmother's care changed all the time depending on who was seeing her. The thing that remained consistent was the seeming indifference with which she was treated. When Dr. Hardeman was 15, her grandmother made an announcement.
She had decided to discontinue her dialysis care. And in my 15-year-old brain, I couldn't grapple with like why would someone would make such a drastic decision? Because essentially what she was deciding was that when she discontinues care, that she would eventually die because she needed the dialysis treatment to be able to live and to be able to function. In addition to it being devastating, the thought of losing my grandmother, the thought of my mother losing her mother, I couldn't understand a healthcare system that would, allow someone to get to that decision. And I remember asking her about it, and she shared with me a letter that was written by her primary care physician. And in the letter, it outlined all of the different health issues that she was grappling with. I think the point of that letter had been to explain to another physician why my grandmother wasn't a good candidate for a particular type of surgery that she was considering. But what I saw in that letter was a laundry list of all of the things that were wrong with her. And essentially at the end of that letter, the doctor said something along the lines of, "And this doesn't give me much hope." Ultimately, what happened is that she decided rather than let the healthcare system control me, I'm going to take control and autonomy of my life and make this decision for myself. What she decided to do, and I feel like this was sort of her love letter in a way to her grandchildren, is that she rented a limo and got all the grandkids together, and we took a limo ride to her favorite neighborhood restaurant. It was actually not far from her house, so it was a short ride, but it was her favorite like neighborhood pizza restaurant. And it was more about the sort of ceremony of it all. And I remember sitting in the limo with my cousins and one of my younger cousins looking at my grandma and saying, "This is the best night ever. I hope we get to do this again." And knowing that this was part of her goodbye to us was really painful, right? And it really, I knew there wasn't going to be another time. And it's one of the most sort of important final memories I have of her. Sorry.
Not long after this, her grandmother passed away at 64.
At that time, this was the mid-90s, 1995. And what we knew from a data perspective about life expectancy is that for Black folks in the United States, their life expectancy was only about 69 years. And that was in comparison to white people who had a life expectancy at that time around 77 years of age.
Dr. Hardeman wants to know why. Why did it seem like physicians weren't listening to her grandmother? And why didn't her grandmother believe that could change? Why were Black people living shorter lives than white people? She decides to become a doctor and show patients, especially ones like her grandmother, the love and care they deserved. Now, the first step to becoming a doctor is to go to school. So much school. And not just to study chemistry and biology and medicine. Dr. Hardeman will also prioritize figuring out what she believes about how care is administered. In 1998, she's an undergrad at Xavier University, a historically Black college in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Being surrounded by a community of scholars who all shared racial identity is incredibly powerful. And so that certainly played an important role as I thought about who I am in this world and what I'm here to do.
Then she heads to medical school at the Latin American School of Medicine in Havana, Cuba.
I just found it really interesting to think about how we can leverage our learnings from different cultures to be able to think about frameworks for liberation and freedom for Black people in the United States.
She returns home to Minneapolis to earn her master's degree from the University of Minnesota. And by 2011, she's conducting medical research to earn her PhD from the same university. Dr. Hardeman is finding that being part of this doctoral program is requiring some adjustments.
I very much saw it as my duty and my role as one of the few Black people, actually the only Black person in my PhD program, to strategically push the agenda forward around equity. Academia is very hierarchical. As a doctoral student, I'm at the sort of bottom of that totem pole and don't have a lot of power. And so I was always very thoughtful about the questions I asked or where I pushed back and where I didn't. And I think part of that, too, was just a matter of survival, right? So I didn't have what I would call now an intellectual safe space. Right? I knew that it was very clear to me that the questions I was asking and my research interests were not necessarily aligned with what most people in my doctoral program were doing or how we were being trained.
Because Dr. Hardeman wasn't asking questions about popular research topics like infectious diseases or brain injuries or mood disorders.
So I approached my PhD program with this question of what's making Black people sick.
The CDC states that African American adults are twice more likely to die from heart disease and 50% more likely to have high blood pressure than white Americans.
Colorectal cancer is the third leading cause of cancer death for men and women, disproportionately impacting people of color.
It has been said before that when white people catch a cold, Black people catch the flu. That seems to be what's happening there in Chicago. Shaquille Brewster standing.
There are always new headlines like these about medical research that shows that Black people have worse health outcomes when compared to white people. One interpretation of these reports could be that Black people are just more prone to illness and death than white people because of their genetic makeup. But Dorothy Roberts, a sociologist and leading scholar on race, gender, and the law, highlights the flaw in this thinking during a 2015 TED Talk, in which she points out that race is a social construct based on, quote, made-up demarcations that have changed over time and vary around the world. She goes on to say that, quote, lawmakers, not biologists, invented the legal definition of races. Dr. Hardeman is studying complex data sets and analytical models, and within those numbers, she is trying to figure out why people that are part of the social categorization of Black have worse medical outcomes than members of the social categorization of white.
And what always felt unsatisfactory to me was the fact that there was never this acknowledgement that every single number, every single data point that we were looking at within those data sets represents a person or a family or a community or a population of people. So as a doctoral student, I began to push back on that and ask questions differently and seek out people from other disciplines to help me think more broadly about these issues. I leaned heavily on professors in sociology and anthropology to help me think about these questions. I leaned on Black feminist theory and critical race theory. And so that led me down this path of really thinking critically about what the fundamental cause of health inequities is in our society. What is it that at its core that fundamentally is causing Black people in particular to be more sick?
By the time Dr. Hardeman graduates in 2014, she is confident that she's found the answer to the question she's been researching for almost half her life.
When I reflect on the question of what is making Black people sick, the answer fully and 100%, my research has shown this time and time again, while it may bear out in different ways every time, at the root of it is racism in all of its forms. We know that where you live, where you work, where you get your education, where your children play, where you shop for your groceries, all of those things matter for your health and well-being. We know that the social context, right? So everything from where you're able to buy a home, all of that it's going to contribute to whether or not you're healthy. And that's around that time we actually started seeing data that showed that 80% of health is attributed to the social determinants of health, whereas it's only about 10 to 20% of health is really dictated by access to healthcare and doctors in the medical field. what that means is that history of our country and what that's looked like over 400 years has contributed to poor health and well-being in a lot of different ways. Often what we see is if you review the medical charts for a Black patient who has been instructed to eat healthier to control their diabetes, but there's no evidence of that, right? The narrative is often that they just don't care. They're non-compliant. They're not doing the things that it takes for them to be healthy. But what we lack is this understanding of how racism contributes to the reality of health and health equity, right? And so if we step back and think about historically how redlining has dictated where this patient might live, and if there's actually a grocery store in that neighborhood that has healthy fruits and vegetables available to them, or perhaps they do have access to that store, but they don't have the money, they don't have employment, those social determinants, or perhaps they don't live in a neighborhood that's safe enough for them to walk and get exercise. And so as a clinician, as a researcher, you have to understand that history and how it's led us to what we're seeing now. And you have to be able to see that within the scope of your patient and their current situation in order to effectively care for them. Let's think about what are the workarounds here? What can we do to offer them something different that still gives them the opportunity for health and well-being?
Once Dr. Hardeman has her answer to what is making Black people sick, she wants to do something about it.
I'm a doctoral student, so I am at the mercy of the people who are training me in a lot of ways, and I'm learning what it means to be part of the academy, part of academia, and what that looks like. And, a lot of it is this socialization process into a culture that is there for knowledge generation. So knowledge generation in academia, generally speaking, means that we are asking a research question, conducting the research, and then publishing it in a peer-reviewed journal. And then that journal sits on a shelf and, often collects dust. For me, knowledge generation and knowledge production meant doing all of that and making sure that the knowledge that was produced was leveraged to affect change. And so it was never sort of satisfactory for me to be able to say, well, yeah, I did this research project or I asked this research question and did these analyses and published this, but no one's doing anything with it.
But there wasn't much she could do to change that, because her job was to research, not issue calls to action. Whenever Dr. Hardeman hit a wall like this or found herself frustrated, she would call up a leader of equal caliber in the education field. The person she turned to first for everything from fashion emergencies to trying to change health policy in America. Her best friend and identical twin sister, Simone Hardeman Jones. This is Simone talking about her instinctual response to finding out her young son had an ear infection.
My friend was like, oh, you called your sister first before Chris, your husband. And I was like, oh, shoot, I did, didn't I?
She and Simone would talk about how hard they were having to work in their respective fields to affect change that felt urgent and apparent.
It shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't be that hard to have a voice, to have a say, to be able to influence policy. And I think so much of that comes down to, particularly in the spaces I'm in as an academic, is there have been decisions historically about who we decide get to be experts and who we trust to be experts. And that gets perpetuated, and then you have to prove yourself as that expert to get that seat at the table. And I'm not interested in perpetuating that. Expertise is because you have lived through something that was traumatic or that was real or that was different, and you have solutions and you have ideas and you have creativity to do things differently.
I just want to also add to that, Rachel, I think about this all the time. I know you do too. It's not just about what's possible in the future, but where we came from and the people, our grandparents and our uncles and aunts and even our parents who have done the work, have fought for the seats at the traditional table, some successfully, some not. And almost it feels like this passing of a torch onto us to keep moving and to keep reimagining and innovating and finding ways to fight for our people.
Dr. Hardeman continues trying to think of ways for her research to live beyond a medical journal. And then, during that time, she and her husband, Dr. Eduardo Medina, decide to have a baby.
Okay, so I should have mentioned this back when we talked about my time in Havana, Cuba. That's actually where my husband and I met. I forgot to say that. So we were part of the same group of students studying in Cuba, and we had a phenomenal time as like great friends exploring the city and learning the city. He's from New York by way of Puerto Rico and Colombia.
He researches health equity like Dr. Hardeman, and the issues facing Black and Brown communities are just as personal and urgent to him as they are to her. Plus, they're both fluent in and in love with the Spanish language. They're a match made in Havana. They get married, and in the midst of residency programs and fellowships, Dr. Hardeman gets pregnant. Being the doctoral student she is, she turns to medical journals to get a sense of what to expect when she's expecting.
I was pregnant and I was reading an article, I think it was in the American Journal of Public Health, about the fact that Black infants are twice as likely to not celebrate their first birthday.
But she knows that there is more to this stat than meets the eye, especially when compared to data like the following.
So when a Black infant or a Black newborn has a Black physician caring for them just after birth, their likelihood of surviving is 2 times as high. It's twice as high. And that I couldn't get it out of my head. These outcomes tells us that there's something else going on. We are asking Black people to access a healthcare system that is not well equipped to care for them for a variety of reasons. So that shows up in implicit bias and assumptions that are made during a clinical encounter. It shows up in mistreatment. So some of my research has shared these heartbreaking stories from birthing people and their families who feel disrespected, who feel not listened to, who are labeled as aggressive during those clinical encounters.
So, not only were the social determinants hurting Black people outside of the doctor's office, implicit bias was hurting them once they made it in. Dr. Hardeman looks for a Black care team and manages to find a Black doula, but not a Black OBGYN. However, the doctor that does ultimately end up delivering their healthy baby girl, Layla, was one that they built a relationship with over the course of her pregnancy. A relationship that was completely unlike what her grandmother had experienced with her physicians.
And I think as a result, I had the type of birth experience that I say everyone should have, right? And that's not to say that like everything was like perfect and peachy and roses, but I felt cared for, I felt respected, I had autonomy, I had the opportunity to dictate my needs and my wants and my concerns and have a conversation with my provider rather than just being told, well, this is how it is.
After Layla is born, Dr. Hardeman focuses her research on health outcomes for Black birthing people and their children. She also decides in 2016 to become a professor at the University of Minnesota. There, she teaches a course called Structural Racism and Health Inequities and works to push forward an agenda around equity and implementation. But that's not the easiest thing to do as a brand new tenure-track professor.
When you're on the tenure track, essentially your job is up for review every year by your peers who are tenured and at a rank above you.
So for the next 7 years, she would need to be cautious and make sure she's fitting into the culture of academia. But once she got that tenure,
I could say whatever I want. I can't get fired is like kind of the, loosely like the idea of tenure, right?
in her classes, Dr. Hardeman is able to be the kind of professor that she'd needed when she was in school.
The goal was to help students as public health professionals understand sort of the theoretical underpinnings to why why health inequities persist, why racism is the fundamental cause of those health inequities. But then the second half of the course is really focused on, so as public health professionals, as people who are going to go out into the world, what is your role in dismantling structural racism? What is your role in cultivating health equity in the spaces that you're in? It was a wonderful and exhausting opportunity to shape the field, the professional field of public health.
Dr. Hardeman loved teaching, but sometimes it felt like her students were looking for her, as one of the only Black faculty members around, to give them the answer for how not to be racist. And some of the professional requests that were being made of her were not high on her list of priorities. Whenever she needed to vent, she'd call up Simone.
We just say black. We text each other, black and tired.
Black and tired, yes. Yes, or I'm calling him black today.
So I'm junior, I am pre-tenure. I am the first Black faculty member in my department. And so part of what I wanted to say early on is like, I am not the answer. I am not the solution. I am a part of it. But I wanted to say, like, don't rely on me to sort of be this beacon of hope. What'd you say?
I'm not the token.
Yes.
The token.
That's a great, so the tokenizing, so my face would appear on all the posters and all the brochures and all the websites. And, for me, it was a strategy like, okay, like, I will go along with this as I am building my career. But once I have tenure, I saw it as my sort of opportunity and enhanced ability to say no and to be a lot more particular about who I engage with, what I engage with, and why, making sure that it is deeply aligned with my mission, with my values, with my goals.
And then a series of headlines inspired Dr. Hardeman to adopt a bold new approach to her fight for equity.
Tracy Ellis Ross here. Want your curls, coils, and tight textures to be juicy and joyful? Well, Pattern Beauty has everything you need to unleash your best wash and goes, twist outs, fades, bantu, knots, and more. Use the passcode podcast15 to save 15% on your next order at patternbeauty.com.
In 2016, new research came out that caused a stir, both within and outside of academia. Here's a clip from PBS NewsHour.
A new study finds African American patients are often treated differently when it comes to medicine and care. The survey of more than 500 people, 400 of them medical students, found implicit bias exists that may help explain why Black people are sometimes undertreated for pain. Among its findings, medical students believed that African Americans felt less pain than white patients and even thought their skin was thicker.
What is it that's making Black people sick? It's not just race, right? It's not the phenotype of someone, how they physically look. It's how they are treated in our society because of how they look.
While processing this data, Dr. Hardeman was also considering what was happening in her latest research study at a clinic called Roots Community Birth Center in a predominantly Black neighborhood in North Minneapolis. The center was run by Rebecca Polston, and Dr. Hardeman was working closely with her to observe the link between the center's culturally relevant model of care and their above-average patient outcomes. In November of 2015, news of the police killing of 24-year-old Jamar Clark in North Minneapolis devastated the community. And then in July of 2016, came news of the police killing of 32-year-old Philando Castile, just 20 minutes away.
I felt that pain so deeply in my body. I felt it every time I turned on the news. Or I actually couldn't turn on the news because I couldn't bear it. And also knowing that there was a little girl in the back seat, a 4-year-old child in the back seat, and sort of all that happened or all that unfolded was just so painful.
And then Dr. Hardeman got a call from Rebecca Polston.
Families and pregnant people were saying, I don't want to find out the gender of my baby People are like, fine, we can do the anatomy scan, but I don't want to know the gender. And Rebecca was astute enough to ask why. And what they told us was the pain of knowing that I'm having a boy is too much to bear right now. I'd rather not know. I remember going to my office at the University of Minnesota and no one was talking about it. It was business as usual. And I sat there thinking, like, how can this be, right? How, we just lost. And it's not that I knew Philando. I didn't know him at all. But to me, I still felt that loss very deeply. And I had no one around me at the time to talk to about it or to process it or to think about what was next. And that's when I started writing.
Dr. Hardeman decides to write a message to her colleagues in the rest of her field that wasn't filled with data sets or complicated analytical models. It was about the knowledge she generated on how to protect and preserve Black lives and an appeal to do something with it.
I went to my husband and he said, I'll help you. And then we pulled in my colleague, Dr. Kazimanal, as someone who has expertise in health policy. And so the three of us wrote a perspective piece that was eventually published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And I only say that because the New England Journal of Medicine is the top medical journal in the world, essentially. And so it's a significant platform. And what that platform did was allow us to write a call to action to our colleagues, to clinicians and physicians and health policy people and health researchers across the country, across the world, saying we all have a role to play in supporting Black lives. Because what it felt like to me and what I was seeing around me was people who were like, oh yeah, that's sad. That's too bad that happened. But it's outside of the scope or the purview of what I do. And it's not affecting my community or my people or my kids. So yeah, I care, but it's back to the day-to-day, back to the norm. And so we really want to push people to think beyond that and to think about what it means to dismantle racism in our own personal spheres. And so we lay out a call to action around what that could look like.
Among other things, they asked their colleagues to examine their own implicit racial bias and beliefs as a way to provide better care to their patients. They asked them to name false beliefs, like that Black people's skin is thicker, or that their blood coagulates faster, or that their nerve endings are less sensitive. Beliefs born of white supremacy, and they used those words, white supremacy. To their knowledge, that was the first time they'd ever been published in the New England Journal of Medicine. They call on their field to start developing a more diverse and community-centered relationship to care. When it comes out, the paper makes an immediate splash.
So here's something that's interesting. So that paper, we don't have any data. Like, it's not an analytical paper. It's what we call like a perspective or a commentary. And what I have been told as a junior scholar, as a tenure track assistant professor was, that's not the kind of stuff that gets you tenure. You have to be publishing papers that have complicated models in them. And so on one hand, I was like, well, is this the right sort of thing to be focusing my time on? But, I couldn't not do it.
But it doesn't hurt her. It's quite the opposite.
And many of you have read her 2016 New England Journal of Medicine perspective article entitled Structural Racism and Supporting Black Lives, the Role of Health Professionals.
This piece provides a remarkable overview of how structural racism impacts health, not just for communities of color, but for our entire society.
Good morning, everyone. I'm extremely happy and incredibly proud to stand before you this morning.
Dr. Hardeman is invited to give keynote addresses and speak at conferences and becomes known as an anti-racism scholar. And then in 2020, years ahead of schedule, in part because of the impact of her publication, she makes tenure. Of course, Simone is there to celebrate.
We ordered takeout from
like a very lavish takeout.
Yes, very huge meal, and set the table, decorated, and had a lovely dinner party. And I ordered Rachel a rose gold coffee mug that says hashtag tenured AF.
And then she went back to work. Dr. Hardeman takes a bold new idea to her bosses.
I wrote this one-page vision for the Center for Anti-Racism Research for Health Equity. And in it, I very broadly sketched out its goals around authentic community engagement, meaning that we're centering at the margins, around narrative change. So really engaging in the work of helping journalists and the media and also just regular people understand that racism, not race, is the fundamental cause of health inequities. I wrote about the need to develop education and training around structural racism and anti-racist research for students, for public health professionals, and for community members. And I also talked about the need to have a trusted resource for policymakers, for public health agencies, and for the media on issues related to racism and health equity. My boss called me to tell me the news. He put my one-page vision for the Center for Anti-Racism Research for Health Equity in front of his colleagues at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota. And they decided to gift me and the School of Public Health $5 million to launch the center. As soon as I hung up the phone with them, I started screaming. I was so excited. And my daughter comes running in the room. She's like, "What's wrong?" And I told her, and she super excited because she could see I was clearly thrilled. And then I hear her 10 minutes later on FaceTime with one of her best friends. And she's like, "My mom's so happy. She got $5,000 to do her research." So I guess yes, something like that, kid. I don't even like to think about it as a seat at the table. And what I really am doing with my research center is building a new table. My grandmother didn't have the chance to live that healthy, full life. She should have lived much longer than 64 years. There are so many people who die prematurely, and it's so often preventable. And so as we work towards achieving health equity, we have to be willing to ask the hard questions. We have to be willing to think big, to think outside of the box. I think there's so many opportunities to do things radically different than the ways that we currently do them. And so I feel like my goal moving forward is to instill the sense of urgency that I feel and everyone around me, and support the next generation of scholars in doing the same.
What kind of healthcare leads someone like Dr. Hardeman's grandmother to believe that dying is the most empowered choice she can make for her life? Why is it that Dr. Hardeman's infant was twice as likely not to see her first birthday than a white infant? Why are Black people told that it is their Blackness that makes them more likely to get diabetes, high blood pressure, heart problems, and other illnesses? As if the biology of their Blackness is the root cause of the diagnosis. But biology is not determined by race. And yet, many medical studies and statistics are measured based on race. This is what the term race-based medicine means. This is a lot to make sense of, and a lot to process, especially for someone who's not a doctor. Because for society to function, for individuals to stay healthy, there's an unspoken agreement of trust that we assume and hope exists with our healthcare providers. That they know what they're doing and that they are treating us according to their oath of first do no harm. And yet Dr. Hardeman was directly impacted by the medicalization of Blackness. Fortunately for us, this leads her to question this agreement and to ask the question of what is making Black people sick. Dr. Hardeman tells us that the answer is racism in all its forms, meaning that the history of our country and not the biology of our race, is the thing that is making us sick. Dr. Hardeman's curiosity and interest in the health and equity of all peoples pushes her to question how doctors see and treat their patients. And she continues to work towards an anti-racist system of medicine. Her work encourages us to look around and see if the places we go for our healthcare are actually serving us. Do your doctors participate in a system of health equity and culturally relevant models of care? Put more simply, does your doctor's care demonstrate love and humanity? Do the pamphlets, staff, artwork, and the magazines in their offices take into account the complexity and diversity of the society that we live in? Does your physician listen before they offer a diagnosis? Does your physician allow you to feel empowered in the decisions that you make about your health? I'm Tracy Ellis Ross, and I hope you enjoyed meeting Dr. Hardeman as much as I did.
I Am America is a co-production of Dear Media and Joy Mill Entertainment. Executive producer, creator, and co-writer is Tracy Ellis Ross. Executive producer, showrunner, and writer is me, Nicole Hill. Executive producer and co-writer is Adriana Embries on behalf of Joy Mill Entertainment. Managing producer is Rosalie Atkinson on behalf of Dear Media. Sound design and engineering by Mitra Kaboli. Our theme song, Strum, is composed by Jesse Montgomery. Story editing by Martina Abrams-Ilunga. Reporting and fact-checking by Siona Petros. Production assistance by Daniel Gonzalez. Clips courtesy of NBC News, PBS NewsHour, University of Minnesota Pediatrics Department, and the Colorado Trust. Executive producers are Brian Dobbins on behalf of Artists First, Jeff Berman and Brett Boutier on behalf of Magnet Companies, and Jocelyn Falk, Paige Port, and Michael Bostic on behalf of Dear Media.